Hi, welcome back to my channel. My name is Laura and today is another Manga Monday video. So this is a video where I recommend manga based on a theme. I try and post these every second and every fourth Monday of the month, and if you're interested in upcoming topics or you want to participate yourself, you are welcome to do that. I will have the information linked in the description below of all of that information. So today, the Manga Monday recommendation topic is historical manga. So these are primarily the titles that I'm going to talk about are ones that are written about a particular historical period, or they are set in a particular historical period. For me, as someone who did study history, this, just sort of the presence of history and the presence of being set in something that has truth and foundation actually makes manga, or makes it better, and almost 100% I would say that if a title is historical, I will love it. If it is set in a historical time period, if it includes historical figures. I don't know that I've read a historical manga that I haven't loved, and I've scraped through, the internet looking at all the different titles that I could possibly think of. I've gone through my entire collection and looked at everything that I have read, and generally I love historical manga, so this is one of my favorite genres to read from. And also it's one that there's so much in it. When you're reading manga, of course, you kind of recognize that a lot of manga is set in different kind of Japanese historical periods, but there's a lot that are also taking place in other countries of the world in different time periods. So there's a lot to choose from in this genre, and it's one of my favorites. So I'm just going to show you a handful, but just know that there are a lot. And certainly if you have a favorite, I would love to hear about it down below, because if I haven't read it, I really want to read it, because it really is my favorite thing. So anyway, let's look and see what I've got. So the first title that I wanted to recommend to you is The Black Museum, The Ghost and the Lady. This is by Kazuhiro Fujita. This is a 2-volume omnibus series that is published by Kodansha, and it basically is the story of Florence Nightingale, who is a real historical figure. She is known or noted to be the mother of modern nursing. So she was born in the early 1800s during a time when nursing was an incredibly lowly profession. It was not thought of very well, and she was born to a very wealthy and well-to-do family, and she just felt a calling to nursing, and so she ends up getting involved in nursing and makes great reforms and changes to nursing to the point where nursing now is, she lent a lot to that profession to kind of make it a very regimented and a very noble profession. This is taking this true hero of history and mixing it with some fantastical elements. So this is basically the story about a ghost who is haunting Florence Nightingale. She is basically at a point where she feels so low that she wishes to die, and so she calls this ghost to her to kill her, and he sees that she is not exactly at her lowest, and so he wants to really torment her and really bring her to her lowest, and so he decides that he'll kill her like she asks, but only when she is at her most despairing. And through the course of these story and these real historical incidents, through these the most horrific experiences, she gains courage and gains strength rather than despairing, and so he kind of has to he continues to follow along with her, but also I think has some real feelings and connection with her, and it's just a really good story. It's, it takes that account that could potentially be not so interesting to read if you were just reading it in a history book, and adds in this really exciting supernatural element. Personally, I think the art is not that great in it, but it is effective, at least in telling the story, and it is a very entertaining one, and one that I was surprised at how much I was really enjoying, and really interested in learning more about Florence Nightingale after I did read this. So I would really highly recommend that you give this one a try. The next title that I'm going to recommend is an out-of-print title, but what would a recommendation video be without something that's out of print? That would be Thermae Romae by Mari Yamazaki. This is a 3-volume omnibus series by Yen Press, and pretty sure it's out of print because we've been having a hard time replacing this copy, which is actually damaged. There's some pages falling out of it, but this is basically the story about bathing culture, and about baths in general. What it does is it takes a character from Rome from 127 AD. He's basically an architectural engineer, and he's been tasked with designing buildings and things, and at the very beginning of the story he basically has been fired from his job because he has too he's not creative, he's not forward-thinking, he's just too kind of lost in the past. And something happens, basically he sort of drowns. He keeps falling in water and partially drowning or getting sucked into drain holes or whatever, and time slips into the future in Japan, and kind of experiences bathing culture in Japan, and through his eyes he's able to kind of solve the problems of his current whatever project he's working, whatever thing that he needs to solve. For example, there's an older gentleman which he and a friend of his help to take to the bath, but because he's so elderly it's quite difficult for him, and then when he actually time slips into the future, into Japan, he sees that, you know, you could actually have bathing in a small room at home, and this is how they would do it here. So he kind of takes that idea and about kind of sort of like some of the innovations of Japanese bathing culture and takes them and uses them in ancient Rome. So this is actually quite informative, particularly about bathing culture. As a story, I would say it's fairly withholding. It really is very episodic. The main character, he sees a problem or is given a problem, and then you know, ponders it for a little bit and just doesn't see a solution, and then accidentally almost drowns and finds himself in the future, sees a solution to the problem, comes back and uses that to resolve the problem. So they're very short kind of episodes, but it really is just a look at bathing culture and how it kind of relates to the past and kind of the good innovations and elements of Japanese bathing. So you can really tell that the author of this just really has a love of bathing culture, and it really is very different from, at least my experience in Canada. We definitely don't have the same kind of culture. The author, I believe, actually does live in Europe. I think she lives in Portugal, and so she might also be a little bit closer to maybe the more European, or is able to actually do some like good research on ancient bathing and ancient baths, baths from antiquity, and so is able to kind of combine the culture that she loves and she knows the best and then combine it with this culture. So I think it really is a good mesh, and despite the fact that there is next to no story, it is totally engaging. I can read the entire volume in a sitting without getting bored at all. So this is a really enjoyable title, and I definitely, it's just such a different take on Japanese history, and just seeing it compared to ancient Rome is just really enjoyable for me. I really enjoy this manga. I think it's really quite fun and quirky just because it is so unusual. The next title you can't escape me talking about because it's one of my favorites, and I recommend it all the time, and that would happen to be Red River by Chie Shinohara. This is basically the story about a 15-year-old girl named Yuri. She time slips the other direction of the previous title, also through water, but this time into 14th century Anatolia, or 14th century BC Anatolia, so almost 2,000 years before that previous title. This one is basically a story about a girl who gets pulled into an ancient world. She gets pulled into this other world as to become a sacrifice in order to kind of curse the current royal line, so that the empress who has actually called her into antiquity will be able to put her own son on the throne. So that is what the basic premise of this is, but of course, as a 28-volume long series, you know that the Empress never really gets her way. It does have some really brutal moments. Characters do frequently die in the series. It is a very kind of sweeping romance, But what's great about it is that this main character, Yuri, she really does learn to stand on her 2 feet. She really does sort of take her place in antiquity and really does become a strong female character in the story, to the point of, you know, even becoming the leader of the armies in the story. And I really, really, really love it. I just think there's so much good in this story. It is a little bit more risque, I think, than kind of the general shoujo manga that you would get, so you do have to be aware of that. It is also out of print, so it might be harder for you to pick up. But if you do have a chance to pick it up, it is really worthwhile. It is one of my favorites. It is so good. And I absolutely love it. And I read it all the time, and I have never been bored with this story, so it's wonderful. I recommend it. The next title that I want to recommend to you is actually based off of some Shakespearean plays, and it is set in the late 1400s, and that would be Requiem of the Rose King by Kanno. So this one is based off of Henry VI and Richard III. So if you've read either of those, this is going to give you, it'll be a pretty good indication of what this is. This is basically the story of the War of the Roses, which was a couple-decade war between families who were trying to ascend to the throne of England. And primarily this is a story of, at least in this one, at least at the very beginning, it is mostly the story of Richard here with the black hair, and he has a terrible dark secret, but he is desperate for his father to ascend the throne. I don't want to really say too much about it because it is so, there's so much intrigue in it, and there's so much kind of darkness in it, and it is quite twisted and convoluted, and you definitely just can't stop reading this. This is so entertaining, and despite the fact that you should basically have an idea of how the war goes and how tragic the ending of the story is, you still can't help but wonder how this story is going to progress. So I would highly recommend that you give it a try. This is one of those titles, though, that there is a lot packed into the story, and so I do think that it does benefit from a binge read rather than reading one volume and then taking a month off, because you do kind of forget information. At least I do, because my memory doesn't last that long. But I definitely recommend it, and there's quite a lot of it out now, so if you did pick it up, you do have a lot that you could actually just sit and binge through. Also, one thing that I want to say is that the translation in it is fantastic. Because it is based off of Shakespeare, it still retains some of that weightiness of Shakespeare's language, the same kind of cadence that you would get in a Shakespearean play, although maybe a little bit more subtle. It's not as, you know, it's not as obvious as a play, but there are kind of moments in this where you're just like, wow, the writing in this is really great. And Jocelyn Allen was the translator of this, so I just wanted to make sure I mentioned her, because the translation of this is really fantastic. I really, really like the writing in this title in particular. The next title that I have takes place mostly in the early 1600s, and that is Vagabond by Takehiko Inoue. This is basically the story of Miyamoto Musashi, who is a legendary swordsman in Japan during a really volatile part in Japanese history. This is a time when, or I think just after Oda Nobunaga is kind of taking control or unifying Japan through conquest. At the very beginning of this, we see Takezo, who later becomes Miyamoto Musashi, fighting the Battle of Sekigahara. So this is sort of like the penultimate battle in this particular time period. So you get kind of historical context right off. This follows a real historical person, but it is based off of a novel, and so there are, of course, like all kind of fictional accounts, going to be liberties in the story. But this one is just really, really great. I have also read most of the novel. I did stop partway through the novel because I didn't want to get too far ahead of the manga as the manga was releasing, but now the manga seems to be on an indefinite hiatus, so I might as well get back to the novel and at least see how the story ends. And that is Musashi by Eiji Yoshikawa. It's a really dense novel, and You know, there's bits that are really quite dry, but it is still very entertaining, and I really like historical fiction, so it's totally okay for me. So this is basically the story of The Way of the Sword. Miyamoto Musashi, he starts as a young man who's just very wild and very broken from his relationship with his father, and over time and over kind of moving from place to place and challenging people in battle, in duels, he discovers the way of the sword, he discovers himself, and he becomes sort of really introspective. He masters the sword and masters himself, and it really is, like, despite the fact that it's very fast-paced and it's very brutal and the battle scenes are epic, it is really very much a story of the inner self, and Takehiko Inoue knows how to write that story, and he very much knows how to illustrate that story, so every time I read Inoue, I'm always kind of blown away by his understanding of kind of the human condition and the human mind and how the human mind changes, and this is no exception. Of course, Takehiko Inoue, just on top of being a great storyteller and understanding how to draw movement and action and just sort of the inner self, he also is a beautiful illustrator, and I'm sure you're already aware of it. Here, this page, for example, he does have some color pages in these single volumes. I don't know what the art looks like in the omnibus, which I think are probably more likely what you'd be able to pick up, the Viz Bigs, but they're just generally really beautiful. I also have a volume of this in Japanese, and the Japanese doesn't have the color here. Like, you can see how incredibly beautiful it is. He just knows how to use a pen and how to use a brush, and one thing I really particularly like about this is that in a lot of the action scenes you can really see the sumie ink painting technique, particularly in the drawing of hair, but also you can see it a lot in like backgrounds and things. And one thing that Musashi later develops as he kind of finds himself is that he also finds sumie art and kind of philosophy, I guess, and so he does have a lot of artworks that he's painted, and so just the fact that you're taking a person who becomes an artist and uses that same technique in the work that you're drawing is fantastic, and I really, really like the parallel. I don't know if anybody else cares about that, but I sure do. I really, really appreciate it for that. This is a great story despite that. You know, despite the history and despite the introspection, it's fast-paced, it's really entertaining, and the action scenes in it are just, like, mind-blowing, beautiful perspectives, and it's beautiful to look at. It is an adult title, it is quite brutal, there is sexual content in this, but overall I think that it's a great title. If you haven't checked it out yet and you are, you know, big into seinen manga, I would definitely say you should be reading this one already. Another title that is quite brutal but in a very different way, and that is Onward Towards Our Noble Deaths by Shigeru Mizuki. Unlike these other titles, this one is a personal account, and it also is basically telling the story of something that happened to himself rather than telling the story of long in the past. So it maybe isn't quite qualify like these other titles, but I think it is really worth reading, and it's a really good title. For someone who really dislikes reading about true war accounts, I thought that this one was really wonderful. This is by Shigeru Mizuki, who is basically the father of Japanese monsters. He was the creator of Gegege no Kitaro and created monsters that are now basically feared in Japan. So he's just sort of an interesting little character, and he's absolutely adorable. You can see him there on the cover. Every time I see his face, I just want to smile. He's super cute. So he did actually fight in the war, and so this is a semi-autobiographical account. I don't know that he exactly puts himself as a character in this, But this is basically the story about the horrors of war, and not the horrors so much as people dying around you through, you know, bullets and bombs, but the horrors of the living conditions and the expectations and just the treatment of other soldiers. So this is a story about a particular company of soldiers. They're sent to basically a remote island and left there to wait until it was their time to kind of join the war. During their time in this kind of remote place, most of the army are treated like dogs by their superior officers. They are getting sick and injured before the war is even started, and so when they do finally get called to war, they're not well enough to fight. It's just a horrible, sickening situation. It is disgusting and horrible, but there is some humor to be found in it, and I think they did just sort of, you did find a little bit of humor in it, but it's mostly seriousness of what war is, and it's absolutely fantastic. Shigeru Mizuki is a beautiful illustrator as well. He does have these very cartoony characters, but he also is just able to draw landscape like nobody's business. Let's see if you can see here. It's he's just a really beautiful illustrator. So if you have a chance, I would say please go and pick this up. It is really, really wonderful and definitely very educational. It's not a part of the war that I really ever thought about until I read this manga, so I would highly recommend this one. So that's everything I recommend for my Manga Monday for this week. 6 titles of historical manga. I could probably go on and on because I really do love historical manga, and there's actually a ton of historical titles that I could talk about. These ones are particular standouts from probably the last 2 years of reading. And they really are all really good titles, so I would highly recommend them. If you like historical manga, or if you've read a historical title and you would like to recommend it down below, I'd love to hear it. If I haven't read it before, I would love to read it because my favorite genre. Other than that, make sure that you go and check out the announcement video for the Manga Readathon. There is a giveaway up on that. You don't have to participate in the Manga Readathon to participate in the giveaway, so go and do that. I also have an AMA video up, Ask Me Anything. You can ask me any questions you want and I will answer them in a video during the week of the Manga Readathon, so please go and ask me some questions. I only have a couple over there, so I would love to get some more questions. And I think that's it for this video, so thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye for now.